So now, hopefully we have the presence of my voice in this room, online, and the presence of the slides both in this room and online as well. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Alexander Lecture. This lecture was created to honor William John Alexander, a professor of English at University College for 37 years, from 1889 to 1926. He was, it is said, the most popular teacher of his time in the entire University of Toronto, likely because he communicated a passion for English literature with consummate skill. It is said that the largest It is said that the largest room on campus, a hall in the old Faculty of Medicine building, had to be reserved for Professor Alexander's regular lectures. He was also blessed by I'm sure, not having to use any technology whatsoever. Following his retirement, the lectureship was established by Professor Alexander's former students and colleagues. He himself attended every lecture series from 1928 to his death in 1944. The series continues to thrive thanks to the generous support of the Alexander Lecture Fund, the University College Alumni Association, and bequests from the Jean Stuart Coop and Helena Stewart estates, which have enabled 95 years of stimulating contributions to the intellectual life of Toronto and of University College. We are extremely honored to have Professor Deirdre Lynch deliver the Alexander Lecture this year. Dr. Lynch is the Ernest Birnbaum Professor of English Literature at Harvard University. Tonight's lecture is entitled The Revolt of Papers, or Bits and Pieces Towards a Feminist Theory of Scrap. I'd like to add some housekeeping notes. This lecture is live recorded. For those attending in person, a microphone will be passed around during the Q&A portion after today's lecture. Please raise your hand, and once the moderator calls on you, please wait for the microphone to ask a question. I'm sure you will be very eager to contribute to the discussion, but please wait for and speak into the microphone in order for our remote audiences to be able to hear your question. For those attending virtually, live closed captioning is available for this event. The option can be turned on by clicking the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your questions, which will be monitored here and brought to our live moderator's attention. I would now like to call upon my colleague, Claire Battershill, Professor of English, to more formally introduce our distinguished speaker.
Thank you very much. It's my very great honor and pleasure today to introduce Professor Deirdre Lynch. Professor Lynch began her post-secondary education at the University of British Columbia and then went to Stanford University for graduate study. She's now, as Professor Stock mentioned, the Ernest Birnbaum Professor of English Literature at Harvard University. Professor Lynch has published widely on 18th, 19th, and 20th century British literature, the theory of the novel, the history of reading, and the history of the book. Her scholarship always insists on the historical specificity and the situated complexity of some of our most fundamental literary critical concerns, from the construction of character to the act of reading, to the pleasures and perils of loving literature. Professor Lynch is the author of The Economy of Character, Novels, Market Culture, and the Business of Inner Meaning, a revolutionary volume connecting the study of literary character with book history. In that book, Professor Lynch posits literary critical analysis and book history as inextricably intertwined, insisting always on analysis that both honors the literary text and rigorously historicizing it, and settling frequently held assumptions about character and what it means and does in the process. The book was awarded the Modern Language Association Prize for First Book. Her most recent book, Loving Literature, A Cultural History, was shortlisted for both the Oscar Crenshaw Prize in 18th Century Studies and the Christian Gauss Award. She's also the co-editor with Alexandra Gillespie of Unfinished Book from OUP in 2021, a volume that has proved indispensable for us here in the Book History and Print Culture program in recent years. Her work as the editor for the Romantic period of the Norton Anthology of English Literature will also be familiar to many undergraduate students. Professor Lynch is the recipient of many other awards and honors, notably including a Guggenheim Fellowship, and at the start of 2024, the Keats Shelley Association of America awarded her its Distinguished Scholar Award for Lifetime Achievement. What this already long but also necessarily abbreviated list of accomplishments will not tell you is how generous and dedicated Professor Lynch is to the study of English literature and to the profession. We were lucky to have her here at Toronto as a faculty member in the English department for a number of years, and during that time, she was a beloved colleague and mentor to many of us here in the room today. So it's a very particular pleasure to have the chance to have her back in this capacity today. She can always be counted on for incisive, precise engagement with any question or discussion she encounters. The answers for Deidre are never easy, and one of her most wonderful qualities as a scholar is her deep questioning of truisms and assumptions we make about how we conduct literary critical practice. In some of her recent work on the contemporary novelist Ali Smith, for instance, Professor Lynch points out that the, quote, leaves, scraps, and fragments in Smith's seasonal quartet, quote, challenge the boundedness and completeness traditionally associated with the codex. And I think we'll be maybe hearing a little bit about that today. Professor Lynch is currently completing Paper Slips, a literary, media, and material history of scrap. And I would like you all to join me in please very warmly welcoming Professor Deidre Lynch.
Going backwards. Yeah. Yay. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to be back at Toronto. I remember this room as the site of English department faculty meetings when we were told that the ceiling was so high because it had been the scene of chemistry experiments, and that allowed for explosions. And that turned out sometimes to be useful for English department meetings as well during my years at Toronto. I'm really happy to have been invited back and really grateful for this opportunity. I will say I'm a little nervous about technology right now. Professor W.J. Alexander is an object of envy for me because he never dealt with slides or Zoom, but I'm going to do my best. So, the Revolt of the Papers, or Bits and Pieces Towards a Feminist Theory of Scrap. And I have some epigraphs, which I won't take the time to read to you, but I will let you ponder them as I get myself in order here, get my papers in order. So, through the 18th and 19th centuries, British observers detected an insurrectionary energy among the papers in their mediascape. Symptoms of an insurgency these observers took to documenting, ironically enough, on paper. Papers, they feared, and this is a quotation, might overwhelm the land. And particularly troublesome were papers in that unbound, scrappy state in which they were emancipated from the discipline of the bound book. In a book, albeit one that originally appeared in multiple serial parts, the narrator of Charles Dickens's Our Mutual Friend remarks with a palpable shudder on that mysterious paper currency which circulates in London when the wind blows, gyrated here and there and everywhere. It hangs on every bush, flutters in every tree, shudders upon every plot of grass, seeks rest in vain behind the legions of iron veils. Consider, too, alongside Dickens's over-mobile paper that does not know its place, the volatile paper objects imaged in this 1812 satiric cartoon about the Prince Regent, an easy target. This is an interior scene, but the papers are no more domesticated than in Dickens's example. Instead, paper objects such as books and pamphlets lie dispersed across John Bull's bedchamber, some entangled with his sheets, others stuffed in the pockets of his discarded clothes, while in Bull's Dream, imaged by the right-hand side of the print, the bills, both tradesmen's bills and parliamentary bills, a map, and paper money have all become so many missiles targeting the British sovereign. In the poem, also titled The Insurrection of the Papers, which this image cross-referenced, Thomas More wrote of how papers, one and all, as if at some magician's call, began to flutter of themselves from desk and table, floor, and shelves. Art historians sometimes use the term pyromania to denote an obsession in the practice of visual art with the illusionistic representation of paper. The term, I've learned, also appears in the writing of the management guru Lawrence Peter, who in the Peter Principle used it to identify the obsessive accumulation of loose paper. Some people in this audience, my husband included, may be pleased to hear that Peters also coined the term papyrophobia to designate a quote unquote abnormal desire for a clean desk. The papyromania at work in 18th century trompe-l'oeil medley prints, like this hand-colored engraving from 1706 by John Sturt, registers both a fascination with techniques of print reproduction and some anxiety about the superabundance born of that mechanical reproductivity in a bravura depiction of media diversity that has him replicating, or should I say quoting, or perhaps even forging actual prints that were currently being sold by others, for instance, the broadside ballad, The Mayday Country Mirth. Sturt depicts a disorderly pile of paper products. Here we see not just engraved prints, but also pencil and chalk sketches and a playing card, all of them, as though they have fluttered of themselves, have seemingly come together by hazard in a jumble, atop of which 4 insects, count them, there are 4, have landed by chance. And the bug's depiction at life size furthers the deception of the viewer's eye that they are on the verge of flying away, suggests that the same thing might be true of these loose papers. In a book on the Anglo-Dutch painter Edward Collier, the historian Dror Varman modeled another approach to imagery of this sort, as he argued for a media era he called Print 2.0, a forerunner to the 21st century's Web 2.0, and as he presented Collier as this era's most cunning theorist. Collier's trompe-l'oeil depictions of letter racks and the paper objects that they contain use oil paint and canvas to create their papyromaniac effects, whereas Sturt depicts printed paper, go back just to remind you, by printing paper. But the two artists converge in their determination to make paper, normally the ground of representation, into the object of representation. As Varman explains, in the early 18th century, the era of durable books that had been launched by the advent of Gutenberg's movable type swerved. Those books were abruptly overshadowed by an explosion of cheap and flimsy mass print that bypassed the codex form. As constituent ingredients of Print 2.0, Varman names unbound pamphlets, newspapers, handbills, and the like. Papers whose nature it is to bear a date, to become quickly outdated, and therefore to change in status, so that from being bearers of text, they transition into mere waste paper. We could add to Varman's list other single-use and throwaway products of job printing, such as trade cards, tickets, and tobacco wrappers. Looking further ahead in this new world media abundance, and also later in the 19th century, built up as cheap postage rates brought unwanted advertising circulars into people's homes. The media theorist Lisa Gittleman comments helpfully on the paradoxical doubleness of paper in her 2010 book, Paper Knowledge. As she says, paper is at once, and I quote her, a figure for all that is sturdy and stable, as in, let's get that on paper, and for all that is insubstantial and ephemeral, including the paper tiger and the house of cards, close quote. Varman's account of the new media situation of Print 2.0 is structured by a comparable duality, with the contrast that Gittleman draws mapped onto a contrast between paper preserved in a state of lockdown inside the bound book and paper in its precarious fly-away, fly-by-night state outside of it. The viewer of Collier's still life paintings, Varman thus proposes, is called on to contrast the durable codex book, that totem object of print 1.0, with print 2.0 objects such as newspapers and handbills, which with their visible dog ears, and look at how crummy this paper looks, which with their visible dog ears and creases are already visibly fleeting. Working at a moment before the word ephemera comes into existence, which we'll do only later in the 18th century, Collier is nonetheless delimiting the category of textual object the word would come to name. His still life paintings systematically demonstrate the difference between books, which supposedly sit outside time, and print objects that of a different sort and which visibly bear the signs both of their dynamic circulation and their imminent obsolescence. In Varman's words, this second sort of print object appears on the canvas, much as it does on Sturt's printed paper, in terms that make it betoken the instant decay of itself. But in this lecture, I am concerned with the practices of compilation that put such materials destined for the scrap heap, the various artifacts of print 2.0, inside of books. I am interested in just how much space the homemade books of the 18th and 19th centuries, henceforth I'll call them manuscript compilations, how much space they dedicated to keeping scrap that was supposed to be thrown away. In a compilation that was put together in the north of England around 1780, this page of pasted in tobacco wrappers, for example, has preserved for 2.5 centuries now papery packaging materials that were not supposed to expect any sort of shelf life. The rebuses and riddles and dad jokes, in all frankness, that tobacco sellers arranged to have imprinted on the wrappings of their wares represent the most negligible kind of text, supposed to be forgotten as soon as they are solved. To a certain extent, the compilations that engage me, by and large the work of female amateurs, model through such preservative practices the venerable domestic virtue of thrift, the frugality likewise exhibited by the patchwork quilts with which such compilations were often aligned. In 1850, the female readers of Lydia Maria Child's The Frugal Housewife were reminded, I quote, that the true economy of housekeeping is simply the art of gathering up all the fragments so that nothing is wasted. But there's more to say about them than that. And in this lecture, which will be in 5 itty-bitty parts, I will also be interested in how the bookkeeping, as it were, for which these female amateurs deployed their handmade or purchased blank books, was often practiced in a fashion that underscores needlessly, perversely even, the transitoriness of the contents the volumes enclose. This mode of bookkeeping both preserves and ephemeralizes its contents. It invests them, and I lean here on the critic Sarah Wasserman's excellent recent account of ephemera, with the push and pull of disappearance and permanence. So part 2. Part 1. There are 2 chairs here, and I feel terrible for people who are having to stand. Yeah, and there's one there too, so yeah. So let me take a preliminary stab at disentangling the paradoxes I have evoked. The plight of poems consigned to paper in its flimsiness is imagined at some length in a poem that was inscribed by hand into a manuscript compilation, now at the Beinecke Library at Yale, that in 1746 was assembled by 2 cousins, Julia Evelyn and Frances Evelyn Boscawen, then newly married to an admiral in the British Navy. According to this contributor to the cousins' book, was identified only by the initials AR, verses on paper can not only be tossed with every wind, but they are also liable to be used for emphatically non-literary uses. how awful it is, his poet laments, that odes that breathe the lover's fire end up being used to light candles, or end up as the rollers with which the beloved might curl her hair. Enter, as salvation for these papers, the media form called the book. In this poem's happy account, Apollo mandates the creation of a volume well fenced with boards around, where his sons, and note the gendering, may shine forever bright with bays unfading crowned. The word boards in that line names the thick, stiff pasteboard that was used for the covers of books. The supposition that has been driving me in my research is that it has tremendous consequences for our histories of female creativity, that in the 18th and 19th centuries, so many women, without being willing to step forth as authors, were willing to step forth as bookmakers, just as Evelyn and Boscawen did, giving their manuscript collection a title and even a title page. These two fashioned their compilation, The Parson's Barn, in conformity with the bibliographical codes that define the published printed book. However, the term that they selected for their title, The Parson's Barn, does suggest something a little more slapdash, a work in progress that doesn't have the finitude of a printed book. Period dictionaries of slang suggest irreverently, and with a little anti-clerical bias here, that a parson's barn is a barn that is, quote unquote, never so full, there is room for more. Here, from a manuscript compilation now held at Manchester Metropolitan University, is a more elaborate title page created by a certain Elizabeth Reynolds, who filled up the folio volume for which this is a paratext by assembling, for instance, a page preserving old concert tickets, by writing a page of original memorial poetry for the politician William Pitt and the actor Edmund Kean, by painting a page of watercolors depicting the order of insects, and also adding to the mix some collaged medleys that beggar description, as here. And by the way, kind of coming out from the cutout lady's head, those are real feathers in this book. If the slide could capture 3 dimensions, I would be so happy. So on and so forth. You get this a sense, I think, of Elizabeth Reynolds' book from this page. It is tempting, however, to risk anachronism in response to her title page in particular, and declare that what we are seeing with this volume is a kind of desktop publishing. For, as this detail from that page discloses, Elizabeth Reynolds has used her pencil to mimic the title page of a real printed published book, given it high culture epigraphs from Shakespeare, Charles Churchill, and La Bruyere, provided at the foot of the page the equivalent of a publisher's colophon, Coppice House, published by Elizabeth Reynolds, 1817. Reynolds is well aware that even those paper sheets that have been gathered and bound up require the addition of a title page to qualify as a proper book. But the makers of manuscript compilations that gather up bits and pieces of paper objects and of things like feathers, Miss Reynolds included, are at the same time very ready to acknowledge that what has been bound and also titled to make a book can also be unbound and dispersed. They often arrange for codexalization and ephemeralization to exist in a contrapuntal relationship. In this lecture, I'm proposing accordingly to explore with you how this female handicraft, in a tricky double move, both honors the codex form, long modernity's primary instrument of knowledge and communication, and also destabilizes it. It thereby reveals the book as being a thing that is by its nature vociferous, made of shreds and patches, of pieces and in pieces. The manuscript compilation is another site where the papers are in revolt. In his 1928 book of aphoristic writings, One Way Street, the German cultural critic, bibliophile, but also inveterate paper pack rat and accumulator of notes, Walter Benjamin, meaning to herald a media revolution, described the book as representing at his moment an outdated mediation between 2 different filing systems. Everything that matters is to be found in the card box of the researcher who wrote it, and the scholar studying it assimilates it into his own card index. I want to backdate by a century or more this dispersive desire to make the whole book recede behind its constituent bits and pieces, behind provisional and shuffleable assemblages of unbound and lodged papers. Doing so can make more evident the conundrums that these women navigated so artfully as they occupied the tricky role of archivists of the ephemeral. To consider their handiwork is to produce a more expansive and democratic account of the populations who participate in cultural history, legitimizing attention to the everyday lived experience of literature in 18th and 19th century homes. But another reason to grant manuscript compilations made by women more attention is to deepen and refine our account of the relationship of women and their works on paper to the structures of cultural remembrance that we associate firmly with literature and books. Accordingly, as I zero in on the self-reflexive bibliodescriptive dimension of these books, I will also propose that we recognize them as the site of a now forgotten female, maybe feminist, theory of modern media and modernity, a theory centered on scraps and scrappiness, which the final two sections of my lecture will aim to evoke. But it might be helpful at this point if I paused so as to sort out some terminology. There's an embarrassment of riches for me to choose from, as I do, to title their manuscript compilations. People in the 18th and 19th century use multiple terms: Parsons' Barn, medley or potpourri, or the garland, or effusions of fancy and fun, or cabinet of music, poetry, and drawing. Furthermore, as the so-called elbow mania took hold in Britain, Western and Eastern Europe, North America, between about 1800 and 1835, a self-reflexivity about the practices of excerpting, transcribing, cutting, pasting, collaging, and compiling that fill up blank books also increased exponentially. Lines that people inscribe into albums, for instance, are often self-reflexively lines that define albums. But those definitions haven't really helped. And as everyone who studies these volumes points out, their variability and their porosity thwart libraries and archives' cataloging systems, making such books difficult to locate and identify. Herewith, regardless, my own attempt at cataloging the multiple forms that the manuscript compilation assumes. Many members of this audience will likely be familiar with the manuscript compilations called commonplace books, blank books in which individuals have transcribed extracts from their reading. And many will know as well that this manuscript book form boasts a genealogy that extends back to classical antiquity. Seneca the Younger arrived readers around 62, in the year 62 in the Common Era, that, I quote, "We should imitate the bees. We should keep in separate compartments whatever we have collected from our diverse reading, for things conserved separately keep better," close quote. Those classical bona fides have been a primary reason for the scholarly attention, particularly from specialists in Renaissance literature, that commonplace books have engaged. But in my own research, I find it helpful not to fence off the commonplace book as a constituent ingredient of the history of knowledge systems or the history of education, for instance, but rather to place such compilations spectrum with other more modern, sometimes humbler, and sometimes more showy homemade books. For instance, humbler books. Historians of print now habitually point out that even at the start of the 18th century, the blank pages in almanacs outnumbered the printed pages, though the almanac, and I did put this in for Julia Grandison, who's right here in the front row, though the almanac was known to be the best-selling form that cheap print took in Britain. Publishers recognized that it was in their interest to arrange for their printed works to elicit manuscript, and so deliberately furnished the book's purchasers blank spaces on which the latter could take notes or keep their diaries or write out passages from their favorite books. When cheap printed volumes are put to such uses, we see maybe the manuscript compilation degree 0. Some decades have to intervene from the opening of the 18th century before we arrive at the moment that when British stationers start selling the wholly blank books that they identify explicitly on the volume spines, for instance, as albums, though the term derived from the Latin alba for white had earlier been used about 16th and 17th century volumes from Germany and the Netherlands, the alba amicorum, also studied by scholars of the Renaissance. Only after that era was the word album naturalized belatedly in the English-speaking world, and tellingly, it does not appear in Samuel Johnson's dictionary of 1755. By the 19th century, album often named the compilation whose contents had been crowdsourced, one that is that gathered literary or pictorial donations, sometimes original, sometimes just copied, from several individuals and thereby recorded over the course of its making the connections of an entire social network. In 1798, a French epistolary novel by Madame de Genlis, her wildly popular The Young Emigrants, offered a kind of how-to manual for albums use in a letter that supposedly accompanies the gift of a volume that the letter writer identifies as a new invention. It's a book of remembrances, a livre de souvenirs. As this character, Juliette, explains, all the persons one loves are requested to write something in the book. One sets down in it one's own thoughts and draws landscapes, flowers, or heads, and after a certain time, the book becomes filled with interesting things that appears from later in this passage that might also include ribbons, locks of a friend's hair, pressed plants from the garden. Over the course of the album's 19th century history, writings that constitute records of thought, as Madame de Genlis's heroine puts it, become less essential to the book form's identity. By the latter half of the 19th century, the album that Juliette described had begun to metamorphose into the autograph album and the photograph album, book forms that some more aged members of this audience might remember from their pre-digital youth. The word scrapbook, for its part, enters English according to the Oxford English Dictionary in 1825 by way of the title of a published miscellany called the Scrapbook, or a selection of anecdotes. The OED thereby illustrates the pitfalls of prioritizing the print record, since, as we saw, Elizabeth Reynolds used the word on her homemade title page back in 1817. Nowadays, as the dictionary's definition attests, we reserve the term scrapbook for the kind of compilation that comes into being as a blank book's pages are progressively filled up with material clipped from other print sources and pasted into their new location for their preservation. The making of such volumes represents a form of writing with scissors, of note-taking, really, with scissors, as Ellen Gruber-Garvey puts it in her important study of how this practice illuminates the history of information management. As a girl in 1940s Oklahoma, my mother-in-law kept a scrapbook in which she accumulated newspaper clippings, the better to keep track of and memorialize the US military campaigns in World War II. But 18th and 19th century definitions of the word scrap also inscribed a whole set of relations that involve the connections between haves and have-nots. Scrap, Johnson's dictionary tells us, is not just a small particle or a little piece, but also a crumb, a small particle of meat left at the table. Scraps are leftovers, but in particular, they are leftovers that ought to pass from those who have too much to those who have too little. Put some pressure on the word scrap. Take into account the many images of beggars and of gleaners and of puppy dogs begging for scraps and other charity cases that amateur bookmakers regularly included in their volumes. And one starts to see how, in the making of their scrapbooks, 19th century women were also enacting convictions about a just redistribution of literary resources. They were insisting that they had a right to claim from others, whether they're friends or the authors whose writings they transcribed, donations of some of their surplus literary wealth. Scrap was also a word then that prompted accounts of the book as a forum for sharing, a definition in friction with what we know about the rise of copyright and proprietary authorship in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I'll be returning to the challenge that definition poses to our conventional romantic conceptions of authorship and originality in just a bit. As you will have inferred from my survey, in this era, few were inclined to insist on the distinction between, on the one hand, volumes created through the figurative cut and paste methods that are at issue when someone or several someones gleans passages from printed sources and copies them out by hand onto blank pages, and on the other hand, volumes created through literal cut and paste methods requiring scissors and glue. As often as not, those methods intermingle in the pages the pages comprising any given volume. So much for the various ways that a manuscript compilation might be identified, though I will add as I close this survey that over the last couple of years, and this is why I'll never finish this book, contemporary crafters have started to distinguish a form called the junk journal from the scrapbook. The former involves valueless throwaway materials, and as a much reprinted newspaper story from 2023 put it, it is to be recommended to those hobbyists in particular who sometimes, and I quote, find scrapbooking, which is journaling's artsy cousin, to be too much. Here is the delightfully over-the-top list of recommended materials provided to the would-be junk journaler in a How to Make a Junk Journal website from 2022. I won't read it in toto, but it's rather than sublime. It includes old sheet music, pages not used from school books, old recipe books, maps, sewing patterns, junk mail, old tickets, incomplete playing card sets, travel brochures, instructions from furniture assembly, old business cards, etc., etc. Those accumulations of printed paper in its diverse, unbound forms return me to print 2.0 and the medley prints that registered the 18th century advent of that new media era. The project on the literary and media history of scrap from which I'm speaking today originated, in fact, when I started noticing that engravings of the kind that John Sturt produced at the start of the 18th century, and here is his work once again, though quintessential products of print capitalism in so many ways, regularly inspired the pages that female amateurs drew and painted for the homemade books that they were crafting in their drawing rooms. Really, this book project began when I became enchanted with watercolor pages like these from a hand-penned and painted book created in Manchester by two people remembered now only as E and T Wilson. Throughout their book, the Wilsons emulate the ocular deceptions of the 18th century medley print and make it seem, though this is an illusion, that the surface of the page we behold has a third dimension and that it has become the temporary resting place for a jumble of flyaway papers, for layers of real rather than represented paper scraps. A couple more pages. Notably, the Wilsons also underscore paper's flyaway nature and vulnerability to accident. The delusive impression of a third dimension on these pages is a function of the artist having depicted the edges of the scraps as though they were beginning to curl and crease and as though they were being tossed by the breeze. I have found such reminiscences of the medley print to be widespread across the manuscript miscellanies of the 18th and 19th centuries, though I've not found many examples as alluring as the Wilsons' pages. Here are two of Elizabeth Reynolds's pages in that visual idiom. Here is a page that a certain Johann Friedrich Upholt donated to a German Liber Amicorum in 1760, and please notice the playing card there. In some ways, these amateurs' emulation of the medley print makes sense. It's an apt emblem for the zany miscellaneity of the scrapbook or album, especially the kind of volume that pools the work of many hands. It aptly honors, too, the compiler's determination to make the book the platform for a multimedia art form. You may have noticed, for instance, that scraps of sheet music sometimes appear in the paintings covering these pages, as here, for instance. Furthermore, the medley print is an artwork centered on quoting and copying. When medley artists such as John Sturt, who was a scrivener as well as a printmaker, use their talents for faithful replication, it is to erase distinctions between original and duplicate. The art historian Maggie Cow, therefore, describes such practices both as deviant copying and as sanctioned counterfeiting. That citationality is another reason why those assembling manuscript compilations would have gravitated to the medley print. It exemplifies their devotion to unoriginality. It's a way of asserting that creativity can consist in arrangement and bricolage and need not always involve composition. The manuscript compilation, too, comes into being through unoriginal paper borrowing. In other ways, however, we should find it puzzling to encounter such reminiscences of the medley print within the space of the album in particular. The Oxford English Dictionary, to return to it one last time, defines the album thus: a book in which contributions such as signatures, memorial verses, and epigrams are inscribed for the owner, especially as mementos or keepsakes. The definition indicates that this book type is to be considered less as reading matter and more as a storage container or repository. The premise also seems to be that in the album, writing should be in secure storage, not liable to being dispersed. A typical piece of album verse by the poet Thomas Moore, here rendered and at the bottom of the page you see on the right, as the inscription on the scroll that someone has inked into an anonymous manuscript compilation from 1812, elaborates one account of the album's program. Moore's very sentimental lines written in the blank leaf of a lady's commonplace book reads as follows: "There is a space reserved for me from all thy sweet memorials free, and here my simple song might tell the feelings thou must guess so well. But could I thus within thy mind one little vacant corner find, where no inscription yet is seen, where no memorial yet has been, oh, it should be my sweetest care to write my name forever there." The poem, especially in the recreated form we see it here on this scroll, is a remarkably direct expression of how album culture sometimes conceptualized pages as cognate to other sites of memory. Imagine, for example, stone walls on which memorial brass tablets have been suspended. It is also notably candid about how the album, in serving as a collection point for the autographs of its owner's friends, catered to the friends' wish to leave a lasting mark, write their names forever there. And yet other kinds of content in albums often appear to have been selected to remind us of dispersion rather than preservation, to remind us, that is, that the book in our hands has come together only as other books have been prized apart and unbound, and so to remind us, for instance, that it has been some other book's misfortune to have its frontispiece and illustrations filched, to fill up its own blank pages. This reminder positions the book in time rather than heralding it as a form that stands outside it. Like their predecessor in cognate form, the commonplace book, scrapbooks and albums are predicated on the idea that written works can be treated as provisional concatenations of detachable and portable passages, which can be moved from one context to another. So, on the one hand, the woman who in the early 19th century transfers some of Thomas More's poetic words into an album is demonstrating her literariness and her taste and her capacity for author love. But on the other hand, in that act of copying, she is also underscoring that those words are only loosely his, only loosely Thomas More's, and that his sentiments can also express her sentiments. Aficionados of the out-of-context quotation or excerpt, these women were in their books bringing into being a remix culture long before 21st century media theorist Lawrence Lessig coined the term remix culture, and long before Lessig contrasted the latter with a read-only culture in which for the majority art is something merely to be passively consumed. The medley prints depicting unbound paper that has been released from its mooring in the Codex book project an account of content as detachable, and so lending itself to new uses. Women might also have been incorporating imitations of these engravings into their bound books, precisely because those engravings evoke literature on the verge of becoming litter, paper that is soon to be waste, on the way to becoming lining for trunks or wrapping for food. The frequent inclusion of playing cards in these depictions functions as another reminder that thought that is committed to paper thereby suffers a subjugation to chance and contingency. To be an archivist of the ephemeral commits one to being conscious of the paradox involved in the codexicalizing of loose leaf. For archiving between the boards of the book arrests mobile paper objects in mid-flight, disjoining them from the moment-to-moment flux of time. How do you bring transient things into focus so they appear on your pages while also doing justice to how their meaning lies in the flightiness that will make them disappear? These questions are the more complex at the end of the 18th century because, as some of my earlier remarks suggested, by then the authority of the codex form book, along with the closely connected authority of the category of literature, has come to be contingent in new ways on the ephemeralization of other sorts of print, dated print, therefore soon to be outdated print. The historian Gillian Russell, whose scholarship complements Varman's account of print 2.0, outlines how, starting in the 18th century, British culture took to asserting a firm and ideologically significant division between the bound book, the indisputable standard bearer for print culture, and the unbound paper, fugitive, flimsy, that was associated both with periodical publications and with jobbing print. Russell highlights in particular the essays of the 1750s in which the lexicographer and critic Samuel Johnson first declared some print materials ephemera, the term that had previously been used in the main entomologically to designate insects that live only for a day. The work of taxonomizing and differentiation that Johnson undertook makes the media alliance between manuscript compilation and the newspaper and periodical all the more noteworthy. The manuscript compilations I have been engaging regularly collapse the divisions whose construction Gillian Russell studies. Indeed, a scholar, Alexis Easley, has recently argued in a book on new media in 19th century women's writing, there was a symbiotic relationship between scrapbooking and the tit-bit culture, as it was called, fostered by 19th century newspapers' miscellaneous columns and their poets' corners. Newspaper and magazine editors made a point of providing the bite-sized lyrics and anecdotes and epigrams that could be scissored out and pasted into their audience's manuscript books, just the size to fill an empty corner. And as I've been intimating, the same blank books in which women stored beloved quotations from the literary classics were also remarkably porous to the everyday stuff of commercial jobbing print. Tickets and visiting cards and playbills and fashion plates scissored out of pocketbooks form a major part of their pasted-in contents. For all these reasons, it simplifies matters to understand the manuscript compilations in the terms Madame de Genlis recommended, only as a keepsake, un livre de souvenir. The accounts that album makers and scrapbookers give of their book type's relationship to memory, time, and duration are more equivocal. Their volumes sometimes deliver a kind of rebuke to the memorializing mood with which they are associated. Women who wrote, drew, painted, or composed in the past, it is worth recalling, had every reason to be skeptical of traditional accounts of literatures and books' powers of eternization, well aware, as they would have been, of the transience of their handicrafts. As the critic Émilie Junquois observes, 18th century women's writing appears, like waste paper, to be a tenuous object. Her point is that manuscript works by women were even less likely than manuscript works by men to survive to claim a place on 21st century library shelves, prone as they were to destruction by male relations, heedless of their work or alarmed by their critical edge. It makes sense accordingly that in this era, many of the works that British women wrote on paper are about paper, a choice of topic enabling some voicing of that skepticism to which I just referred. In her 1740 poems on several occasions, Sarah Dixon, for example, more than once imagines the precarity and especially the combustibility of paper. In one poem, and I adore this poem, the paper on which a male writer has written a letter of seduction speaks directly in its own right. So the paper's talking. And it addresses with remorse the man's hoodwinked female correspondence, thereby rebelling against his design. And kind of the poem ends like this: take this kind hint, despise the squire, and gently lay me on the fire. In her 1814 Ubi Sunt poem in couplets on the fate of newspapers, Isabella Lickbarrow imagines how the newspaper, once so eagerly anticipated, is now in an altered state forlorn, now in scattered fragments torn, part wrapped around the kettle's handle, part twisted up to light the candle. Lickbarrow concludes, however, on a positive note, imagining that the destruction of writing ultimately entails the replenishment of writing, perhaps preferred the pipe to light for some dull, heavy, witless wight. These pieces of writing will with tobacco's fumes infuse the inspiration of the muse and furnish many an empty brain. If so, will write and sing again. That's how her poem ends. The speakers of many of the verses contributed to albums express a similar philosophical insouciance about the future cutting, tearing, or burning of the paper surface on which their verses have been written. To inscribe oneself in an album, Thomas More's album poem, which we looked at just a little while ago, to inscribe oneself in an album, Moore promises, is through a transient act of writing to create something that will last. The inscription is conceptualized as transcending the momentary. But an alternative account of the album's relationship to memory is projected by this pre-printed title page. By the 1820s, a lady could purchase such loose pages to bind into the front of her album and thereby take advantage of this paratext power to confer bookhood on her collection. This image depicts, as the poster boy for the album's project of bookmaking, a gentleman turned urban scavenger. He is on the hunt amidst the street litter, his portfolio at the ready, exclaiming greedily as the caption suggests, "I want all the scraps I can collect." This scavenger is allied with the beggars and gleaners, who I noted earlier also get claimed as mascots for manuscript compilations. I am even more interested in the scavenger's supplier, the ragged bill sticker behind him, who pries off the walls the motley bills posted there, which apparently have come to be more valuable as waste paper than as conduits for information. That they have become old news is underlined when we spot that one of the posters that is about to be trashed actually advertises a new album for the year 1827, presumably marketing a book whose novelty has worn off and which is now past its read-by date. On these city walls, nothing remains for long. One can imagine this bill sticker at work in the shrine of memory that Thomas Moore evoked in his album poem, pulling down those inscriptions too. The critic Alexis Easley, whom I quoted earlier, stresses 19th century women's involvement as writers and editors and as clippers and copyists in the new media of their moment. The embrace of the promiscuous energies of modernity that she describes is in notable tension with conventional accounts presenting album making and scrapbooking as a backward-looking nostalgic project. The curatorial labor creating those volumes, because it is women's work, has often been associated with a regressive nostalgia and a piety about home and the homebound. But those associations overlook the dynamism of women's engagement with material texts, a dynamism embodied by unbound paper circulating at speed. Thinking about her ways of keeping alive the tension between the scrap and the book, also the acts of destruction as well as of creation that her scissors work entails, we might even connect the scrapbooker to a figure like Charles Baudelaire's painter of modern life. The latter's dialectical art, as Baudelaire wrote in 1854, is to attend to, I quote, the ephemeral, the fugitive, the contingent, the half of art whose other half is the eternal and immutable. That art involves both the passing moment and all the suggestions of eternity that it contains. Baudelaire himself, needless to say, would have been horrified at my association of the painting of modern life and women's works. The reclamation of the momentary and the ephemeral in his essays goes only so far, a limitation that speaks volumes about the gender bias that shapes even his notions of aesthetic value. He can celebrate an engraver for the Illustrated London News, indeed he does, but not a female amateur. So in concluding, I will reach for one more term to try to specify the interest that scrap albums hold for our accounts of 19th century media and memory work. It's obliterature, a coinage from a 2018 essay by the modernist critics Melanie Mitchell and Arthi Vade, who borrow it from Kate Zambrino. By obliterature, Mitchell and Vade have in mind the casual, minor, and ephemeral writings that are expelled from literary criticism's traditional purview: junk mail, diary entries, and in the 21st century, Snapchats or tweets. Obliterature, they explain, I quote, will never be elevated to the status of art, is unlikely ever to be more than tenuously archived, and may even harbor ambivalence or regret with respect to remembrance. It is, they propose, a shadow formation of capital L literature. As we wrap up, one last pre-printed title page from the early 19th century may prove useful as we think about how the feminine role of archivist of the ephemeral blends preservation and transience, literature with obliterature. This page's usefulness is a function of how it half conceals and half reveals what it knows about the affinities that scrapbooks, in this case, have for ephemeral print. Here it is. And let's take a moment to register the anonymous designers. This is a printed page, this extravagant graphomania. And now, having taken a breath, let's decipher this writing. The message that one takes away if one reads only the words in large type is that the title of the book that follows is this: Scrapbook intended for the reception, arrangement, exhibition, and preservation of prints, drawings, poetic effusions, prosaic fragments, some of which might otherwise lie unnoticed in the portfolio of the owner or her friends, and containing others prepared and procured expressly for the purpose, the whole designed to divert the anxious, amuse the studious, cheer the gloomy, and employ the idle. But things are more complicated. At the bottom of the page, the fine print instructs the reader that a meaning is there if you read it with care. So warned, you are to begin again at the top of the page, and you will find that when you read the fine print, this book turns out to be speaking for itself, in rhyming couplets even. I am a scrapbook, as my pages show. The book begins in a disconcertingly lively first person, and then partway down the page, it pivots to describing what it is not. I'm not, you see, one of the exploded tribe, the dog-eared wastebook of some desk-worn scribe, which to the nursery at length consigned is filled with odds and ends of every kind. The category of odds and ends is then inventory. And at this point in my lecture, you might be flashing back to the website for the 21st century junk journaler. So here they are. Prints from the tops of shop bills, tradesmen's cards, drawings which elder miss with scorn discards, tobacco wrappers falsely called poetic effusions, sentimental and splenetic, worse than prosaic, cut out from the papers, fragments of slips for lighting pipes and tapers, some of which by mere luck contain the bantling of a riddle maker's brain, which but for this might otherwise have gone down time's broad stream, which still keeps rushing on, sweeps to forgetfulness the scraps that lie unnoticed on its banks and bids them die. Of course, the very fact that this scrapbook needs to protest, albeit in the fine print, that it does not contain such odds and ends confirms that some volumes of its kind do. This page's equivocation, its way of making us see double when we try to establish the nature of the volume that it identifies, emphasizes nicely the challenges that scrap poses to books' traditional memory work and orientation to time. This afternoon, while assembling myself the various bits and pieces of a compilation, I have tried to do just the noticing that this page's reference to scraps that lie unnoticed appears to prohibit. And I look forward now to hearing from all of you about what loose leaves you might want to add to the medley. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful lecture. Thank you. So Deidre is going to moderate her own questions.
I am.
But I'm here if you need me.
Michael, thank you. Oh, that's right. I'm so sorry. Yes, of course.
Thank you. Deirdre, thank you so much. So lovely to have you back, and what a wonderful talk. So enjoyable. And that's kind of what I want to ask you a couple of questions about. Humor and play and jocularity in the method. And because I was just thinking immediately with the, like, how fun to do a front page where you're kind of like mimicking a front page and even drawing a mercurial statue as a gesture for your own particular form of play. So it might not be humor as much as play as a mode or an affect of that does this work of keeping knowledge unstable. You know,
Yeah.
like the joke can't be monumental. It can't go on forever, although some jokes do. But like, you know, there's such a irreverent part of all this that doesn't destabilize, but actually gives people a certain kind of purchase, you know, on what manuscripting can be. So almost every single one of your examples was delightful, which is not the case in most talks. And so that's that, and I think that that's part of the wonderful point, and maybe that's why you're kind of in like wonderful amateur spaces, because that's a real critical posture.
Yeah.
That's not too self-important. So I'm wondering if you're thinking a lot about humor, play, jocularity, which does kind of align you strangely with Derridian play too. And
Absolutely.
yeah, it was really fun. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, a simple answer and then a more complicated answer that I will make up on the fly. I think that kind of that these books were sources of entertainment for long winter's evening before there was the internet and before kind of there was television. I mean, there is a way in which these are very social artifacts. They're not, especially the ones that I have emphasized are ones that kind of are shared among many people, that would be part of sort of the social spaces of a house, that would be out on a parlor table. And they are meant to sort of generate conversation. And I think that that's kind of definitely part of the playfulness. They do have sort of memorializations for sure. I mean, and kind of, I could have given you lots of epitaphs and memorial inscriptions and poems of mourning. I think what's remarkable about them, though, is how kind of the affect will turn on a dime from kind of one corner of the page to another. And I don't think it's just because kind of these people are disorganized as they make them, though maybe they are that. I think it's that these really, they take very seriously the quality of miscellaneity that defines the books. So Derrida has not been my muse for this, Barthes has, because Roland Barthes talks a lot about the album in his lectures on the preparation of the novel. And Barthes charmingly, wonderfully, in his autobiographical Roland Barthes par Roland Barthes, his Barthes by Barthes book, sort of says, I would have loved to have been a 19th century lady. I would have painted, I would have played the piano. Kind of, he says that I'm going to get the exact term wrong, but he basically says that the female amateur is the secret kind of revolutionary of her moment. And I want to cling to that. And it's meant a lot to me that kind of these women's works, which are so easy to dismiss, actually seem to kind of resonate with kind of the French theory that I read as a graduate student in ways that I hadn't noticed when I was still a graduate student. So thank you very much for that question.
Fantastic. Yeah, love it.
Thank you so much, Gigi. So I have a question about a very specific type of paper, which is perhaps not a scrap, but I'm thinking about the offcut. So so obviously when they're cutting out collage pieces, they're leaving a bit of the paper behind in many cases. And I'm curious whether those are repurposed ever. Do you see them? Or is that like that's so far into the dustbin that we don't keep that at the end of the day?
Such an interesting question. I mean, nothing ever goes to waste in the 18th and 19th century, right? So the dustbin is not really a dustbin. There will be somebody kind of going around the streets collecting waste paper, but I've seen things where people haven't finished cutting something out, which, another thing I think one likes about working on this is that there is a toleration of imperfection. So that kind of, there are many, many books that aren't finished. So I have seen things that are not complete, like paper cuttings that somebody just thought, I can't be bothered. I'm not going to do any more scissoring today, and just stuck it in the back of the book and never stuck it in. But I haven't, in a different part of this book, which is on scrap, I talk about antiquarian scrap, and Angela Esther Hammer, who's back there, has heard me talk about that a little bit, the kind of conviction that you would find bits and pieces of like incunabula from the early era of printing in kind of bits, stuff stiffening the spine or in the end paper of other books, and sort of the ways in which that scrap gets mobilized in ways that set up new sort of counter-historical narrative. So I've thought about kind of, that's sort of offcuts in some ways, but it's not quite what you were asking about. But offcuts are related to scrap in all sorts of ways. If we think about the scrap as what Samuel Johnson says it is, right? The food for the poor, then kind of offcuts are clearly really relevant. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire. And thank you, Deirdre. I was actually going to ask a kind of antiquarian themed question, and now I can't remember if this is something that we have talked about before or I've heard you talk about before, but I was thinking about the relationship between what these women are doing and either or both antiquarianism and classicism, classical study, which men are doing by collecting scraps, except they're much more ancient scraps. To what extent is this a feminized version?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I was telling Michael, who's just left before this event started, that I could go on at great length about why I want to pull scrap away from fragment. Scrap is ordinary. Scrap is the back of the drawer stuff. Fragments are precious and enumerated, but scrap and fragment often converge in antiquarian work, especially because sort of histories of early printing, which are sort of getting going at the end of the 18th century through the Romantic period, often involve sort of reclaiming bits of old books that had been treated as waste. So as I was saying to Claire, kind of the bit of a sort of medieval manuscript that you find vellum stiffening the boards of newer books that then get sort of pulled apart for that bit of vellum. There's wonderful stories about sort of people finding wrapping as wrapping for cheese, kind of ballads from kind of the 16th century. So that paper has been redefined as waste, rediscovered. It starts ascending to being a bearer of textual meaning again. It's all very volatile in this period. And in kind of my last book, I wrote a lot about sort of something called the bibliomania, which hinged this episode of incredibly inflated prices for old books that precisely hinged on sort of the fact that kind of people were able to buy for sixpence what they were then, spending hundreds of pounds on 10 years later. So I'm also thinking about sort of, well, I've worked on Walter Scott's scrapbook, and there's a wonderful collector, antiquary in Edinburgh in the later 19th century named David Lang, who just has boxes. I saw these when we were both at the National Library of Scotland in April, boxes and boxes and boxes of just like loose bits of pages, not even whole pages, that he's sure would generate something. And it's like many projects, this one doesn't seem to have been realized, but the University of Edinburgh has all the boxes still. Yeah. Oh, and I know what I was going to say. Then there's also, well, and there's this delightful but horrible episode in the history of medieval studies, the Anrot manuscripts, which some people here might know about, where kind of Philip Henry Anrot lets his children make a scrapbook out of illuminated manuscripts. So they cut out the letters and glue them and spell their names on the pages. So, I mean, there's many kind of connections with antiquarian studies.
Yeah, that's already an extremely rich answer, so I'm going to hand off. But I was also thinking of even older scraps or fragments of papyri with all the classical study that's going on in English and in German culture at this time.
Yeah, I mean, a fun fact is that John Johnson, who was his collection of print ephemera at the Bodleian Library, I've really relied on, because he was the first person to start collecting printed scrap. He collected packaging and trade cards and things like that. He had been a scholar of papyri in Egypt prior to kind of his return to England and his changing track and deciding to collect the sort of print ephemera of his own modern world. And he kind of says in autobiographical notes that it was sort of, he got the idea as he sort of started doing these digs and figuring out that he was looking at other people's trash. And shouldn't that be collected too?
Thank you very much.
Will, yeah. Sorry, I forgot I'm supposed to do this. Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk, Deirdre. I really appreciated the attention you drew to the resonance of some words like scrap and album. And I wanted to ask you about just two others. The Johnson, the image from the dictionary, it said scrap, but when applied to written things, it should be scrip.
Yeah.
And then you punned on literature and litter. And litter, I mean, I know in the Middle Ages, it means the straw, the stuffing of a mattress.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, is litter and literature a pun available in the 18th, 19th century? And
Yeah,
is scrip and scrap, or these?
Yeah. I mean, litter and literature is just starting to be just at the very end of the period that I'm looking at. But I mean, it had already started to mean anything that was sort of untidy and disorderly, right? Which kind of paper tends to be. But I don't know about scrip and scrap. I haven't been able to get very far with that. Do you have any ideas about that, Will? No? No. Pamela.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. That was a great talk. I was just in Edinburgh recently, and the Waverley train station is like a scrapbook to Walter Scott, because they have all of his, I don't know, pithy quotes actually embossed on the I don't know, what do you call those, walls, fences, whatever. Anyways, but then you mentioned David Lang, and at the moment I have a bunch of undergraduates transcribing the letters between David Lang and Daniel Wilson, which to me seems like maybe just kind of, I'm not quite sure why we're getting them to do that, but it's for another project, but it's interesting to see them kind of go through this process. But then that made me think of, how would you compare this process of collecting scraps to the parallel process that's going on at the same time of, HBC
Mm.
men from Scotland going and collecting what they seem to think of sometimes as scrap, but sometimes as treasures from the New World, from indigenous collecting. When, again, when I was at the museum in Edinburgh, found was shown many things from an area where I work in around Fort Francis, and it's hard to figure out how they decided what they were collecting, what they were not collecting. So I'm just wondering how you think about, similar to Angela's question, how you think about museum collecting or would-be museum collecting in relation to this process of collecting.
Yeah. So kind of when I started to work on these materials, I found like a early 19th century French definition, what is an album? An album is a portable museum. And in some ways, this is pint-sized collecting. Kind of women don't claim the budgets for libraries, but they can kind of have books like these. So I think that's the first way that I would answer that question. But I think another way that I would answer this question is by referring to a book that I was just teaching myself on Wednesday, Kelly Weisskopf, and Assembled for Use, her book on Indigenous compilations, which is about the ways in which kind of people looking for sort of the longer history of Indigenous First Nations literature should look at the compilations that kind of people like Samson Occam and Charlotte Johnson, who was Anishinaabe, made in the 18th and 19th centuries. Those haven't been examined because we assume that citation and compilation are not valuable, that they are kind of, that they don't have any creativity, that there's nothing to see there. There's just look kind of previous scholars as sort of like docile copying. And what Weisskopf says is you can see all sorts of kind of political savviness in the way, for instance, that Charlotte Johnston, who's the sister of Jane Johnston's Schoolcraft, whom some of you will know, Anishinaabe, kind of working in writing in Detroit, and they kept albums too. I mean, the fact is this is totally widespread, so that kind of, I guess, kind of to get back to your question, Weisskopf notes how things like the Massachusetts Historical Society, starting in the 19th century, start sort of hoovering up these compilations to kind of claim them for a white settler history. And so, but she returns to them and says, look at kind of all of the ways in which we can reclaim, undo that archiving, which has changed their meaning, and kind of release these other meanings in these compilations. So I would think about this maybe dialectically, that there is that process of collecting, but there's also a kind of sometimes literal, sometimes figurative process of repatriation that people are doing through smart readings of these materials. And we'll have to talk about Daniel Wilson. Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I'm up here for, wait, is this one on? Do you hear this? Okay, great. I'm up here to read off any online questions. So this is a question that's come in from an online participant. They say, thank you for a great lecture. I believe you touched on this, but would you be able to expand on whether and what ways women may have expressed their own experiences as women through scrap or scrapbooking?
Yeah, well, I mean, all sorts of ways. For one thing, kind of, I mean, I started the project when I found that there was a completely different canon of English literature in these books than the one I had been taught, or than the one even that sort of men are writing about at the moment. So I would say, first of all, you go to these and you see kind of women are copying out different things than kind of the literature that we remember from this period. But I would also say that kind of the whole bent of these collections towards, my first slide had a quotation from a Dickinson scholar about the ways in which Dickinson, in refusing publication, in writing on little scraps, writing on bits of envelopes near the end of her life, was prioritizing minor accumulations over something more monumental. And I think that that is a kind of feminist work. So I think my answer to that excellent question would involve kind of that contrast, I think, kind of. But it's an excellent and huge question that I don't know that I can do justice to. Yeah. Bob.
Thanks. I'll say the same thing everybody else said, which was, it was very funny, and very easy to attend to, and very mind expanding, the lecture. But I kept thinking about that other Toronto guy, Harold Innes, and I kept thinking about the materiality of 2.0 and the paper, and I don't have the question quite right, because it doesn't fit easily, but the idea of dissemination and communication in the empire also has as its the reaccumulation. So the communication was not just to send stuff out, but was to get stuff in.
Yeah.
But paper, unlike clay tablets, unlike papyrus, like each medium has its own economy. And I'm just wondering if there's some way of thinking about that intersection.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely. I mean, that intersects very well with Kamala Clausen's question, but it also makes me want to stress again that I think kind of there is a way in which sort of we forget this in English studies. We're very book-centered discipline, but sort of periodicals and newspapers were the new media of the 19th century, and and they were portable and cheap to send in ways books have never been. And there are all sorts of instances where you can see, I mean, it's sort of shocking because this scissors work always seems sort of like iconoclastic and destructive, but scissors work can be a way of sharing things better. So when Margaret Fuller, a wonderful sort of US feminist of the 1840s, gets to Manchester in the 1847, and she goes to a Mechanics Institute lecture, and she meets a woman, and I haven't been able to trace this yet, and it's driving me crazy, but she writes in a letter about meeting a woman who decided to kind of advance working class education in Manchester by cutting up important communications and pasting them on walls, sort of kind of releasing things from their bondage in the Codex book and disseminating things like that. And it's like kind of, there is a way in which like this scissors work was seen as emancipatory and kind of, and that scrap was seen not just as a remnant, say the way fragment is, but scrap was seen as modern because it could circulate so easily. It was dynamic, it was built for speed, kind of cutting up. Shakespeareans at the end of the 19th century are all in favor of cutting up like first folios, because you will kind of see, more people will see stuff if you kind of transport it across. I mean, I know it's shocking, totally shocking, but it's also got a good kind of print 2.0 emancipatory progressive politics behind it as a motive. Yeah. I don't know your name, but at the very back, yeah.
Thank you very much. I think this kind of follows on from what you've just been talking about, but I was wondering a little bit more about the kind of intersection of femininity and the class dynamics that you're discussing. And it's so fascinating to me the way in which the idea of scrap, drawing together the beggar with the practices of the kind of scrimping housewife, but the albums so embedded a lot of the examples in the kind of really elite practices of the accomplished lady and her sort of social and artistic world. So yeah, just that's really fascinating to me, and I'm having trouble phrasing that as a question, but yeah, the practice of certain types of femininity and this kind of scrap gathering across the social spectrum, maybe?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. There's a kind of unseemly cross-class masquerade, right? These ladies are pretending to be urban scavengers or gleaners or beggars or like one-legged beggars who are veterans of the war or something. Like all of these figures appear on these title pages. And I do want to denounce that, but I also want to kind of seize on sort of the utopian kind of remembrance of like a textual commons that kind of might be at issue in thinking of everybody as having a right to part of the literary wealth. I mean, this was their alibi for kind of, you know, copying out stuff that didn't belong to them, sort of violating in their penmanship copyright law. And, you know, and they would also kind of hound ladies, some ladies, people like Scott and Robert Southey complain, are like asking me to write for free in an album poems that I would, you know, really rather sell in the marketplace. So, I mean, they were pests, obviously, sometimes, but they kind of knew it. And that this goes back to sort of the playfulness that Michael Cobb mentioned, that there is a sort of playfulness about that assertion of right to other people's stuff that I kind of like a lot. Yeah, yeah. But obviously, kind of this is a kind of middle class gentry avocation. Some of the books that I was discussing are great folio volumes that would have cost a lot. On the other hand, I've seen kind of flimsy little almanacs being used as commonplace books as well. I think kind of this desire to fill in blanks with one's own writing kind of goes across the social order by the 19th century.
I have another question online. This is from Ayla Moreland. In your research, have you come across printed books that include scraps tucked into the pages? How do you think these inclusions could impact your thinking on books and scrap? Could we consider these inclusions as a reading practice?
Well, there is a whole trend for extra illustrated books where you take the work of an author you really love and you cut up other people's books to add new illustrations to those pages. This was an incredibly costly practice. And again, it does raise questions about the offcuts, right? Like what's left afterwards. But there is even a print from, I think, the 1860s called The Destruction Room that shows a bunch of men seated around a table cutting up books to create the illustrations that will extra illustrate from the outside other books. In other words, they're saving the practitioners of this craft a step and doing the cutting themselves. One of the things that I think, because we've neglected these materials, we haven't thought about enough is how many books in the 19th century, books and loose sheets, were made to cut up, purposely made to cut up, like sticker books now, right, that we buy for children, right? There were books of scrap. Cruikshank did one, for instance, that you're meant to cut up and then either put into you put sort of what you've cut out into your own book, or you put it on a fire screen or something like that. Book destruction is so difficult to talk about with people in literary studies because we're all so alarmed by it. But there were books that are now very difficult to find because they were cut up, that were expressly made to cater to this scissors work.
I'm moving
Yes.
over to
Yeah.
the microphone. I hate to interrupt. This is such a great and interesting conversation, and thank you for a really great lecture and for the thoughtful questions from the audience. That was quite something. I have questions. I want to say Herta Müller, the Nobel Prize winner, and her scrap poetics comes to mind for me as well. But I'm sure everybody has these kinds of things, so I shouldn't hog the microphone and just come up with my suggestions here. Thank you, Deirdre, for a wonderful talk. Thank you, Claire, for the introduction. Jay, for moderating the online portion of the Q&A. The team, UC's team, for putting together this hybrid event, the last of this this term. You as audience, both online, I was wave into the sky when I'm, and also people here for attending, being engaged, providing questions for the Q&A. This is a last endowed lecture this academic year, but do please check out our website. We have an exciting roster for the coming academic year already. The first one being the Graham Lecture in Science with Sarah Seeger, the astrophysicist from MIT. So that hopefully will be very interesting. So I hope to see many of you here, not only for the English lectures, but for all of our endowed lectures. But for now, please join us for the reception that is following tonight's lecture next door in the senior common room. And also join me in thanking once again Deirdre.
Thank you for your questions.